perfidious Eldar. They had the stars in their grasp, and now are left to sift the dust of their once fabulous realm. For all their intellect and mysticism, they could not contain the beast within them, nor tame the wild monsters of the shadow. Why should we pay them any heed? From Inquisitor Grunwald of the Ordo Xenos. The Eldari, or the Eldar as they were long known to outsiders, are an ancient and highly advanced species of humanoid Xenos whose vast empire once extended the width and breadth of the known galaxy. In its time, the Eldari Empire was without equal in the galaxy, spreading across both real space and the webway. They counted themselves masters of the stars, and every Eldari was born a potent psyker. Even death was no barrier, for when the Eldari's spirits eventually left their mortal bodies, they dissolved peacefully back into the Imperium to be reborn again in new forms, for the warp did not thirst for their souls then as it does today. But 10 millennia ago, the Eldari's overweening pride and their fall into amoral and hedonistic practices led to a cataclysm that all but eradicated their kind and resulted in the birth of the chaos god Slaanesh, known as She Who Thirsts to Them. Despite their boundless power, the heart of their civilization was torn out by this catastrophe of their own making, forcing many of the surviving Eldari to pursue different strategies for survival to protect their souls from being consumed by She Who Thirsts. These strategies have shaped the nature of the survivors' cultures. In the 41st millennium, there are 5 major subcultures or kindreds of the Eldari species: the Asuriani or craftworld Eldari, the Drukhari, the Harlequins, the Exodites, and the Ynnari. There are also bands of independents who survive by raiding other species' shipping and commerce, many of whom are Suriani who have left the often rigid and confining culture of their people behind. They are known as the Asuriani Outcasts and the Eldari Corsairs. The Asuriani fled the original homeworlds of the Eldari Empire in great continent-sized starships called craftworlds. These craftworlds are now scattered across the galaxy, only connected to each other by the labyrinthine corridors of the webway. The Asuriani seek to protect themselves from the hunger of She Who Thirsts through the use of a soul-capturing psycho-crystalline technology known as Spirit Stones and the rigid code of behavior called the Asuriani Path. The Drukhari are the descendants of those Eldari who originally settled within the webway, particularly the ancient city of Komorar. The Drukhari protect themselves from the hunger of Slaanesh by following what the Asuriani call the Path of Damnation. These piratical people revel in the physical and emotional pain of others, for feeding upon the psychic residue of suffering is the only way they can stave off the slow consumption by She Who Thirsts of their own souls. The Harlequins are the servants of the Eldari laughing god Kegorak, who fled into the webway at the time of the fall of the Eldari and were protected from the thirst of Slaanesh by their god's power. The Harlequins are the keepers of the Eldari repository of chaos knowledge known as the Black Library, and they are the only Eldari who still move freely among all of the other factions. Their purpose is to maintain among their fellows the knowledge of the Eldari mythological cycles that form the foundation of all Eldari culture. The Exodites are those Eldari who fled the ancient homeworlds before the fall and chose to settle on verdant, unsettled planets known as Maiden Worlds. The Exodites are protected from the soul thirst of Slaanesh by unifying their souls upon death with the world spirits of their home planets and from the darker impulses of the Eldari psyche by pursuing lifestyles marked by more hardship and less labor-saving technology than any of their brethren. And the Inari, also called the Reborn, are a religious sect of Eldari drawn from all of the other factions who serve the partially awakened Eldari god of the dead, Yenneed. Led by Yenneed's high priestess and chosen prophet, Yvraine, the daughter of Shades, the Inari came into existence just before the birth of the Great Rift and the start of the Era Indomitus. The Reborn seek nothing less than the full awakening of Yenneed, who will then do battle with Slaanesh, destroy the Chaos God, and restore the Eldari people to their lost greatness. Inari no longer need fear Slaanesh's thirst, for upon death they become one with Yenneed. The Eldari appear very similar to humans in their anatomy, although the comparison can only be made on a superficial basis, for in their minds and souls, they are truly alien. The Eldari stand taller than the average human male, with longer, cleaner limbs and handsome, striking features to human eyes. Their skin is pale and unblemished as polished marble, yet with a surprisingly supple strength underneath it. Their keen ears are pointed and their slanted eyes possess a penetrating quality more akin to that of a hunting cat than a man. The most fundamental difference can be seen when they move, for they each radiate an inhuman elegance and poise. This is especially evident in the sinuous grace with which they fight, and the dexterity with which they field their weaponry. Every gesture is laden with subtle intent, and their reflexes are dazzlingly fast. A casual, languid gesture can end in a pinpoint thrust, should the necessity arise. On closer inspection, every aspect of the Eldari physiology betrays their alien nature. Their hearts beat at twice the speed of a human's, and their minds race through possibilities and process emotions so fast that even the so-called geniuses of human history appear dull by comparison. Even their lives are greater in span. The Eldari enjoy lives of rich sensation and wonder that can stretch over 1,000 Terran years, unsullied by illness, frailty, or disease, unless they die by violence or accident, of course. Most of them are not even considered mature until they have lived for at least a standard century. All of them can manipulate mental energies to a degree. Each is psychic to one extent or another. It is said the ancient Eldari could read thoughts at a glance, whilst those who trained their minds for war could crush a foe's weapon with a simple narrowing of their eyes. Even the complex technology of their race is based upon psychic engineering, the manipulation and even creation of matter using mental energies alone. But such raw power has its price. The same neurological mechanisms that grant the Eldari mind such power also inclines it far more towards extremes than that of a human. To an Eldari, all of life's experiences are available on a far grander scale. The individual rewards of study, the exhilaration of battle, and every imaginable pleasure or sensation in between. An Eldari will, at some point, climb the most noble peaks of accomplishment, just as they will plunge into the darkest abyss of doubt. Their capacity to experience emotion enables them to attain transcendent bliss, or, in contrast, experience soul-racking sorrow. This spiritual intensity is writ large throughout their culture, manifesting in sublime works of art and music, but also giving rise to a darkness that threatens to engulf them all. No creature, not even an Eldari, can taste such rich fruits in an uncontrolled way without consequence. For an Eldari to yield absolutely to the intensity of their desires would destroy them. Such was the fate of their ancient empire, whose depravities brought about the fall of the Eldari race itself. Those amongst them that actively cultivate their psychic potential seem to exhibit a much extended lifespan, even by their standards, one proportional to their prowess as a psyker. In this way, the leaders and seers of the Asuriani may live for several thousand standard years. Now, one matter of note is that the Eldari have sometimes referred to humans simply as mammals, typically with a derogatory label in the Eldari lexicon like monkey, implying that for their part, they evolved from something else, something more advanced than the primates that are the ancestors of mankind. However, given the Eldari's legendary arrogance, this may also simply be a way for them to put themselves above the other intelligent races of the galaxy, particularly the humans, who are currently the most dominant intelligent species, much to the Eldari's disdain. They likely see themselves as completely separate from the normal classifications of animal groups. Indeed, they may not even have naturally evolved at all, as they are the genetic creations of the Old Ones, much like the Orcs, created to defend the galaxy and the Old Ones' civilization from the depredations of the Necrons and their Catan masters during the War in Heaven. In matters of reproduction, the Eldari kindred called the Drukhari actually produce much of their population through artificial means, raising new generations from their artificial conception in amniotic tubes. Naturally born Drukhari as a result of sexual reproduction are rare due to the long gestation period of the Eldari infant. The ones that are naturally birthed from their mother's womb, known as trueborns in the society of Kamarach, are often very privileged in Drukhari society because of the circumstances of their birth. As such, trueborns are arrogant and see themselves as far better than the majority of other Drukhari, those born in the amniotic gestation tubes, and derisively called the half-born by the small minority of trueborns. The entire species of beings who once ruled the galaxy-spanning Eldari Empire for millions of Terran years are called the Eldari. In the wake of the Fall, the survivors of the Great Cataclysm adopted new names for their varying subcultures or kindreds. The Eldari who fled their ancient empire in the craftworlds eventually called themselves the Asuriani, since their culture was redefined by their decision to pursue the Asuriani path that they believed had been laid out for them by the chief Eldari god, the Phoenix King Asurian, or Asurian. Linguistically reflecting their diminished status, the Asuriani made themselves known to outsiders as Eldar, a name which came to be applied mistakenly to the entire species by Imperial scholars for many millennia. Likewise, the Drukhari were the malevolent faction of the ancient Eldari who had chosen to remain within the webway after the Fall and continued to pursue the decadent and hedonistic ways that nearly led to their extinction. However, they were often referred to by outsiders as the Dark Eldar, a term which they rarely used for themselves and which was first coined by Asdrubal Vecht, the supreme overlord of Comarach, from the Eldari phrase Eladrith Ineas in the 32nd millennium. Those wilderness-loving Eldari who settled on Maiden Worlds many solar decades before the Fall in the hopes of avoiding the worsening corruption of the original Eldari culture are known as the Exodites. The servants of the Eldari laughing god Kegorak, who were protected by his influence within the webway from being slain during the Fall, are called the Harlequins, in the most common translation of the Eldari term for the faction into Low Gothic. In recent years, since the formation of the Inari faction, which contains members of the Eldari species from all of the other factions, it has become common for many of the different cultures to once more refer to themselves using the ancient term Eldari. This reflects the Inari belief that with the awakening of Yanid, the Eldari god of the dead, their species is once more on the path to resurrect its lost glory. In the era Indomitus, the term Eldari has come to be preferred to Eldar, though the original name for the Asuriani best known by the Imperium of Man is still often used interchangeably. However, it is now more correct to refer to the Eldari of the Craftworlds as simply the Eldari, or Craftworld Eldari, or when comparing them to the other Eldari kindreds, the Asuriani. The Drukhari are still often referred to in the Imperium as the Dark Eldar. When war calls, we all ought to answer. Would that it were not this way, but for our people to survive, we must all tread the darkest of paths. Yet I regret that many of our kin have grown to see such obligations not as a duty, but a joy. I do not love the blade for its form or its keen edge, but only for that which it defends. Must we pay for existence with our very souls? from the introspections upon perfection from Kisaduras, the Anchorite. The ancient history of the Eldari stretches back over the millennia to a time when they dominated the stars completely. Yet, for all their splendor and might, they brought a terrible curse upon themselves that sundered their empire forever, leaving the ravaged fragments of their race teetering on the brink of annihilation. The star-faring history of the Eldari is long and encompasses glories and sorrows alike. When the Empire was at its height, their homeworlds were paradises, their powers godlike, and their armies unsurpassed. As the Terran's centuries slid past, their status as lords of the galaxy bred an arrogance that led to a cataclysm. A proportion of their race survived that dark time by fleeing from disaster upon the great vessels known as the craftworlds. Others settled verdant planets far from the heart of their empire, and still more hid in private realms of their own making. Yet there was no real escape from what was to come. Apparent perfection, like that of the ancient Eldari, is all too often blighted by pride. Over 1 million Terran years ago, they alone ruled the stars as the undisputed masters of their own destiny. Such a position was their right, they thought, and their preeminence was beyond doubt. In many ways, the Eldari had good reason for such hubris, for no other race had posed a serious threat to their wealth and stability for time immemorial. They were convinced that they no longer had anything to fear from the galaxy at large. And they may have been right, but the true threat came from within. The doom of the Eldari, when it came, took a form far more subtle and dangerous than that of an alien invasion. At their peak, nothing was beyond their reach, and nothing was forbidden. The ancient race continued their glorious existence, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the dark fate that awaited them. They plied the stars at will, experiencing the wonders of the galaxy and immersing themselves completely in the endless sensations that it offered them. Such was the technological mastery of the Eldari that worlds were created specifically for their pleasure, and stars lived or died at their whim. On hundreds of idyllic planets seeded across the stars, they pursued their inclinations as they willed, indulging every dream and investigating every curiosity. They mastered the labyrinth dimension of the webway, expanded their realms into the furthest corners of reality, and learned much about the universe that has since been forgotten. When their spirits eventually left their mortal bodies at death, they dissolved peacefully back into the Empyrean to be reborn again, for the warp did not yet hold the danger for Eldari souls that it has since their fall. There were, of course, many wars. Even when the galaxy was young, there were upstart species seeking to gouge out petty empires of their own, and the Eldari waged wars against the sprawling Necron dynasties that ravaged dozens of star systems and cost trillions of lives. Most of these conflicts, though, were so short-lived that the ease of their victory left the Eldari ever more sure of their ascendancy. Even the greatest of all their wars, The conflict over 60 million Terran years ago that first forged their species in alliance with the legendary beings called the Old Ones, dimly remembered in the mythic cycle of the craft worlds as the War in Heaven, did not humble them. In their hearts, they reigned supreme, and no other power could end their dominance. The catalyst that brought about the Eldari race's fall came from the very depths of their collective psyche. The innate need to fuel their passions and indulge in every extreme. Their people had long outgrown the need for physical labor or manual agriculture due to the highly advanced and automated nature of their technology. Their society provided all the required necessities of life without individual effort, leaving long Terran centuries for the Eldari to spend sating their every desire and whim. Fueled by an inexhaustible curiosity, many gave way to their most hedonistic impulses. Exotic cults sprang up across their domains that eclipsed the noble pursuits of old, each dedicated to esoteric knowledge or sensual excess. The core of their race began to look inwards, inexorably seeking new ways to explore the full range of emotion and sensation. Such behavior was perilously decadent and, in the end, corrosive to the soul of the race. The pursuit of excess gradually became a blight upon the whole society. The acts of the pleasure cults began to transcend those of idle curiosity or even extreme addiction. Eldari from every corner of the Empire wallowed in their most unnatural impulses in the pursuit of debauchery. As the cults gained a tighter hold over their society, they became increasingly divided. Those who saw the foulness that corrupted their people for what it was became known as the Exodites, and they departed to found colony worlds on the fringes of the Eldari Empire. As the civilization slid further into anarchy, others repented of their ways and fled into deep space aboard world ships called craftworlds. Most Eldari, however, continued to glut themselves on the pursuits of the depraved. The sorrow of those left who mourn the loss of innocence eventually turned to bitterness and spite. In time, brother fought brother, and sadistic killers stalked the shadows in search of victims for their vile lusts. No life was spared in the pursuit of pleasures, both murderous and perverse. A sickness of vice overtook their race, and blood flowed through the streets amid the bestial roar of the crowd. Their hidden realms in the webway, the network of tunnels that spread between real space and the warp, became sprawling palaces of avarice and sadism, and entire worlds were bent to the pursuit of the darkest of sensations. As the moral corruption of the Eldari race tightened its stranglehold, echoes of ecstasy and agony began to ripple through time and space. In the parallel dimension of the Imperium, the psychic reflections of these intense experiences began to coalesce, for the shifting tides of the Empyrean can take form around intense emotion. Slowly, silently, a nascent god of excess grew strong in the depths of the warp. Within the warp, thoughts and emotions generated in real space flow together in the form of psychic energy, fed by fellow feelings until they achieve a consciousness of sorts. They become entities of greater or lesser potency depending on the intensity of their origin. Amidst the swirling psychic energy of the Empyrean, the corruption of the decadent Eldari became manifest on a horrifying scale as the flood of raw emotions coalesced into a gestalt consciousness. What an unimaginably foul and sickening thing it was that the Eldari unknowingly raised in the warp. It was a dire shadow of themselves, of what they had become, of nobility and pride brought low by perversity and shamelessness. Worlds burned as the Eldari slew and laughed and feasted upon the corpses of the dead. Slowly, the great enemy stirred towards wakefulness. Too late, the Eldari realized that they had created a god in their own hideous image, a god grown immense and potent by suckling upon the dark fodder of their soul. No creature was ever conceived that was as terrible or perverse as the major chaos god Slaanesh. It is a name the Eldari will not speak, instead whispering Saelanthresh, translatable into Low Gothic as She Who Thirsts. When Slaanesh finally burst into divine consciousness, there was not one Eldari alive who did not feel its claws in their soul. With a howl of raw power, it roared into supernatural life. A psychic implosion tore at the universe. Countless billions of Eldari screamed aloud and fell dead. From the moment that Slaanesh burst into being, the soul of every living Eldari was forfeit. Upon the death of the body, an unprotected one's soul would be dragged into the warp, and thence to an eternity of hideous torment within the psychic gullet of She Who Thirsts. In a heartbeat, the shining Eldari civilization that had lasted for eons had its heart ripped out, leaving a pulsing afterbirth of pure chaos in its place. The spirits of the Eldari were drawn from within them and consumed as their blasphemous creation took its first infernal breath. Intoxicated with this potent draught of billions of souls, Slaanesh laughed and looked upon a universe ripe for the taking. Within the warp, thoughts and emotions generated in real space flow together in the form of psychic energy, fed by fellow feelings until they achieve a consciousness of sorts. They become entities of greater or lesser potency depending on the intensity of their origin. Amidst the swirling psychic energy of the Empyrean, the corruption of the decadent Eldari became manifest on a horrifying scale as the flood of raw emotions coalesced into a gestalt consciousness. What an unimaginably foul and sickening thing it was that the Eldari unknowingly raised in the warp. It was a dire shadow of themselves, of what they had become, of nobility and pride brought low by perversity and shamelessness. Worlds burned as the Eldari slew and laughed and feasted upon the corpses of the dead. Slowly, the great enemy stirred towards wakefulness. Too late did they realize that they had created a god in their own hideous image, a god grown immense and potent by suckling upon the dark fodder of their souls. No creature was ever conceived that was as terrible or perverse as the major chaos god Slaanesh. It is a name the Eldari will not speak, instead whispering Silantresh, translatable into Low Gothic as She Who Thirsts. When Slaanesh finally burst into divine consciousness, there was not one Eldari alive who did not feel its claws in their soul. With a howl of raw power, it roared into supernatural life. A psychic implosion tore at the universe. Countless billions of Eldari screamed aloud and fell dead. From the moment that Slaanesh burst into being, the soul of every living Eldar was forfeit. Upon the death of the body, an unprotected Eldar soul would be dragged into the warp, and thence to an eternity of hideous torment within the psychic gullet of She Who Thirsts. In a heartbeat, the shining Eldari civilization that had lasted for eons had its heart ripped out, leaving a pulsing afterbirth of pure chaos in its place. The spirits of the Eldari were drawn from within them and consumed as their blasphemous creation took its first infernal breath. Intoxicated with this potent draught of billions of souls, Slaanesh laughed and looked upon a universe ripe for the taking. The epicenter of the psychic apocalypse lay within the gilded heart of the Eldari Empire, in the northwestern region of the galaxy from Terra. All Eldari within thousands of light years were reduced to lifeless husks, their souls forever claimed by She Who Thirsts. Even those who had foreseen the catastrophe and fled upon the craft worlds were overwhelmed, with only those furthest from the devastation surviving. The remote Exodite maiden worlds remained largely untouched, but within the space of a single moment, the Eldari had become a doomed people. Their nemesis was born and would hunt them for the rest of eternity. Though the psychic shockwave focused upon the Eldari, billions of humans, orcs, and creatures from other intelligent species were obliterated as well. Warp space convulsed as a cosmic hurricane raged across the galaxy. The fabric of reality was torn apart, and the warp spilled from the dimensional rift into the material universe, turning hope into despair and paradise into hell. Psychers of all races howled with pain as their people died in storms of blood and madness. The roiling wound in real space spread outward until it completely encompassed the Eldari realms of old. This gaping lesion would come to be known as the Eye of Terror, and until its size and horrors were surpassed by the Dathodian, the Great Rift, it stood as the largest area in the galaxy where the warp and the material universe overlap as part of a warp rift. Within its reaches, demons bathe in the raw energy of the Empyrean, whilst demon princes and the worshippers of chaos rule over former Eldari paradise planets turned into nightmare worlds of fire and darkness. For 10,000 long Terran years before the fall of the Eldari, the warp had been riven with storm and tempest, making it almost impossible for the vessels of lesser races to travel any great distance between the stars. With the birth of Slaanesh, the warp was becalmed, its rage temporarily spent. A new equilibrium was reached as Slaanesh joined the ranks of the major Chaos Gods. With the warp storms around ancient Terra finally dispersed at the end of the period known to humanity as the Age of Strife, the newly risen Emperor of Mankind was able to launch his great crusade to reunify the scattered worlds of mankind. A new power took its place in the galaxy as isolated human worlds from across the stars were united under the same banner. In this way, the fall of the Eldari heralded the rise of the nascent Imperium of Man, and so mankind inherited the stars. In birthing Slaanesh from the endless tides of the warp, the Eldari created their own greatest enemy. After its dire waking, the Chaos God developed a taste for the souls of the Eldar, where before, when one of their race died, they would pass peacefully into the warp in order to be reborn. Now they face eternal torment, for Slaanesh has a perverse and twisted appetite that can never be sated. She who thirsts will not rest until the Dark God has claimed every Eldari soul. The disgraced survivors of that once glorious race are doomed, and they know it well. In the darkness of space, those who escape destruction upon the craft worlds cling to what remains of the culture of the fallen Eldari Empire. They consider themselves the true children of Asurion, the Phoenix King of the Eldari pantheon, preserving the art and architecture of their people and passing their ancient history from generation to generation via song, dance, and the recital of myths and parables. It is for this reason that they name themselves the Asuriani. Aboard their continent-sized vessels, these fragments of the Eldar race sailed a sea of stars, always seeking to stay one step ahead of she who thirsts. This is primarily achieved through the use of spirit stones. When an Asuriani dies, their soul is captured in a waystone, a precious psycho-reactive gem worn for such a purpose. The Spirit Stone is then retrieved from the fallen Eldari and released into the Infinite Circuit, the crystalline psychic power grid that runs through the Wraithbone core of every craft world. In such a way, the spirits live on, safe from the horrors of the warp, and in a twilight existence that allows the Asuriani dead to watch over the living. The Asuriani were not the only Eldari to survive the fall. On far-flung planets teeming with natural life, known as Maiden Worlds, the Exodites have carved themselves a survivalist niche. Savage, primal places where everyday life was far harder than that known by the ancient Eldari. These realms helped the Exodites to remain focused on the aesthetic lifestyle they had chosen, largely living pre-industrial lives unaided by the advanced technology and automation of their forebears. They live in harmony with their adopted worlds, the world spirits of these planets protecting the souls of the exodite dead in much the same way and using the same technology as the infinity circuits of the craft worlds. The exodites will fight aggressively to protect their homes and maintain their isolationist ways, though many are also allied with the Asuriani. Cloistered deep within the hidden city realms of the Webway, particularly the massive dark city of Komorach, those Eldari survivors, protected by the psychic protections embedded ages ago by the Old Ones in the corridors of the labyrinth dimension, conceal themselves in their palaces of depravity, still reveling in the debauched lifestyle that led to their fall. Known as the Drukari in the Eldari lexicon, they mock and jeer those ravaged by the downfall of their race from the dubious safety of that twilight realm between the material universe and the warp. Even though they would never admit it, they know in their hearts that, try as they might to allay their fate by subsisting on the psychic emanations of pain and terror they seek to produce in other sentient beings, Slaanesh will always claim them in the end. And finally, a small group of Eldari fled deeper into the byways and hidden corridors of the Webway, shielded and guided by one of the few surviving Eldari deities, Kegorak, the Laughing God. These harlequins are welcome in every surviving Eldari community, where their dances, dramas, and martial performances keep the legends and ancient histories of the Eldar race alive, serving the vital function of remembrance for a species that often fears it no longer has a future. The time of ending. As if the unnatural hunger of a voracious and sinister god was not a dire enough threat, the Eldari must also contend with a galaxy that is no longer theirs. In the bloody wake of their fall, the race of humanity has grown to preeminence. The Imperium of Man has ascended, conquering much of the galaxy in the name of their god, the Emperor of Mankind. The Eldari, whose maturation patterns span nearly a Terran century, cannot compete in numbers with the species whose generations multiply with a frantic pace of vermin. The teeming armies of mankind have brutally swept aside many dangers while stamping their mark upon the stars. In the process, they have awoken many more. The Eldari see in humanity the failings that led to their own downfall, and fear the bitter destiny that they will reap as a result of their Imperium's uncompromising hatred for other intelligent species, hunger for power, and constant wars. Such a rich fodder of dark emotions from the weak-willed humans swells the dark god's power and ripens the galaxy for conquest by the forces of chaos. The Imperium's blind aggression has also contributed to the grave threat posed by another primitive species. Lacking the understanding and foresight of the Eldar, mankind fails to realize they only strengthen the orcs with every battle they engage them in. The green-skin race has become so prolific that many Asuriani seers believe it has reached critical mass, their numbers too large for even the most protracted cull to have any real effect, and should the orc hordes unite their efforts, all the artifice and cunning of the Eldari would not be enough to stop them drowning the galaxy in blood. In recent millennia, new foes and old have also emerged, Foremost amongst them are the invasion fleets of the Tyranids, having crossed the interstellar void purely to feed. Each craftworld and exodite planet represents a bounty of biomass that the hive mind covets greatly. From the galactic east, the Tau, one of the galaxy's youngest and, in many ways, most ignorant starfaring races, wage an ideological campaign of assimilation and destruction, while on countless tomb worlds the Necrons awake from the great sleep. These most ancient enemies of the Eldari, whose rivalry dates back before the fall, are eager to renew their war against their much diminished rivals. Eclipsing all other threats, the Eldari's most doom-laden prophecies have been fulfilled by the opening of the Great Rift called the Dathodian in the Eldari lexicon. In the wake of this lesion in reality, warp storms have broken across the galaxy, and the slaves of the Dark Gods spill out in unprecedented numbers. Amidst the madness and slaughter of these apocalyptic days of the period called by the Imperium the Era Indomitus, a new Eldari deity, Yanid, has been made manifest, and while many have pledged themselves to the god of the dead, others question the methods of the newborn Inari faction, the so-called Reborn, who claim him as their patron. Not since the days of the fall have the Eldari been so fragmented and assailed, and for those of their race who yet survive, war remains their only hope. While their many foes lack the technology, wisdom, and skill of the one-time Children of the Stars, in numbers alone they seem insurmountable. And yet, the Eldari are a proud race, determined that the flame of their people will blaze brightly once more rather than flicker and die out. The first thing one must learn about the Eldari is that they are a race of fragments, broken, scattered across the galaxy. In culture, geography, and technology, the disparate elements of the Eldari race vary wildly, even within a single sub-race. There is great diversity of tradition and attitude, from Inquisitor Bronislav Chevak, the teachings of the unholy. The surviving Eldari people are now divided into several different factions or subcultures, sometimes called kindreds, each defined by the way in which they chose to save themselves from the great curse wrought upon them after their fall. No matter where they go in the universe, every one of them is at risk of having their soul consumed by she who thirsts upon death. It is this central fact of their existence that defines how each faction has chosen to carve out new lives for themselves. First up we have the Asuriani, or craftworld Eldari. They are those of their race who repented of the ways of the pleasure cults only a short time before the fall, and sought to leave the heart of the decadent Eldari Empire behind before disaster could ensue. As the heart of their civilization was torn out by this catastrophe of their own making, many of the survivors, now calling themselves Eldar to outsiders, and the Suriani among themselves, fled the core worlds of their empire upon gigantic, continent-sized starships once used for commerce and trade that they named craftworlds. the remnants of the ancient Eldari culture that survived the cataclysm among the Asuryani preserved much of their species' history in the form of traditional stories, songs, and dance. Written records, monuments, and visual records were almost completely destroyed, except for a few instances where they were taken aboard voidcraft fleeing from the doomed worlds. Now, the Asuryani cling to survival by a thread, fighting the horrors of the galaxy with ritualized discipline and consummate skill. The Asuryani rely on mystical technologies like psycho-crystalline spirit stones and the psychoactive wraithbone infinity circuits that comprise the skeletons of their craft worlds to store their souls after death and prevent their consumption by Slaanesh. It is the use of these technologies and their pursuit of a rigid system of behavioral modification to keep their darker impulses in check that shape the Asuryani lifestyle and define their culture as distinct from that of the other Eldari subcultures. For this reason, the Asuryani are defined as a culture by their pursuit of the Asuryani path. This philosophy teaches them how to balance their potent minds and pursue constructive goals rather than falling to the amoral pursuit of pleasure and selfishness that ultimately destroy their ancient empire and still defines their dark kin, the Drukhari. The Eldari are a naturally psychic species, and all Asuryani possess the potential to become powerful psykers if they choose to pursue the path of the seer. They can use these innate abilities to shape matter, which lies at the foundation of their extraordinary command of technology. The Asuryani are further divided up into separate cultures based on their craft world of origin. There are dozens of these worlds scattered across the galaxy, but 5 of these have proven the most politically and militarily influential on their Asuryani kindred. First, we have the Enlightmenment. Far out on the frontiers of the galaxy, on the edge of explored space, lies the Enlightmentent craft world. The Enlightmentent Asuryani are zealous in their vigilance against the touch of Slaanesh, even more so than the other Asuryani. Enlightmentent is an unusually strict craft world in making sure its citizens follow the Asuryani path and other craft world traditions. In response, many of the more freedom-loving individuals from this world choose instead the path of the outcast, becoming rangers or even Eldari corsairs who roam the galaxy and make their living raiding primarily Imperial commerce. While all craft worlds make use of the rangers, who are the most highly accurate snipers amongst the Eldari, none field or produce more than Enlightmentent. Though Enlightmentent rangers do not reside upon the craft world and prefer to travel the galaxy, these rangers retain their loyalty to Enlightmentent and will return to their home craft world on occasion to visit family and friends. Aside from deploying large numbers of standard rangers, Enlightmentent is also the only craft world to field the highly skilled rangers known as Pathfinders. These snipers, without compare, can cause havoc amongst even the most powerful and numerous of enemy forces. In times of extreme need, such as when the Imperium of Man's forces invaded Enlightmentent, the craft world sometimes recalls its rangers to contribute to its defense forces. Whereas their kin have forgotten their people's duty to watch for the return of their ancient enemies, the Necrons. The Asuryani of Enlightmentent have not. When the Necrons first began to awaken in the late 41st millennium, Eldar was quick to respond, sabotaging the systems of awakening tomb worlds and lending aid to exodites threatened by their re-emerging enemies. Eldar uses a sword rune which represents the Sword of Vol, the final divine weapon forged in Eldari myth for the Smith God's desperate battle against the war god Kayla Mencha Kane. It represents the defiance and determination of the craftworld's people. Eldar and its forces are associated with the colors blue and yellow. The craftworld is known to be located in the Ultima Segmentum that was the heart of the ancient Eldari Empire. Next, we have Biel-Tan, the most martial of the craftworlds. The people of Biel-Tan constantly strive to return the ancient Eldari Empire to its former glory. For the Asuryani of Biel-Tan, the path of the warrior, the life stage that encompasses the aspect warriors, is always considered the first step upon the Asuryani path. Upon reaching physical maturity, a Biel-Tan Asuryani becomes an aspect warrior, and only once they have fulfilled this role can they continue alongside the normal Asuryani path. They have a strong honor code and believe that the best way to die is in battle fighting the enemies of Biel-Tan and the Eldari. Consumed with bitterness, they wage an endless campaign of xenocide against those foolish enough to cross their path. Biel-Tan's armies contain the highest percentages of elite troops of all the craftworlds, and few of the staple citizen militia called guardians that most craftworlds call upon in times of war. Their highly trained forces are known as the Sword Wind, and they often come to the aid of exodite worlds beset by orcs, Drukhari, or other Xenos dangers. As the Asuryani of Biel-Tan see it, when the time comes for the Eldari to reclaim what is rightfully theirs, the Paradise Maiden Worlds and the planet of the Exodites will be the first staging points for their conquest. The World Rune of Biel-Tan is also the Eldari Rune of Rebirth, and its name actually means the rebirth of ancient days. Next, we have Iyanden. The Iyanden craftworld was once one of the largest and most prosperous of all remaining Asuryani craftworlds. The Iyanden barely survived an attack by the Tyranid Hive fleet Kraken, which nearly destroyed the craftworld and killed 4/5 of its population. On the verge of total annihilation, Iyanden was saved from complete destruction by the exiled Eldari Corsair Prince Iriel, who had formerly been the High Admiral of the Iyanden fleet. Iriel and his outcast Eldari pirate raiders, even though previously vowing never to return, could not bear to have their home craftworld destroyed and launched an attack on the Tyranid fleet. The subsequent battles destroyed much of the craftworld's infrastructure. Today, many of its sections are still in ruins, and the population is spread thinly across its ruined sections. This forces Iyanden to often call upon the spirits of its fallen in its infinity circuit, raising more than the typical numbers of Wraith Guard and Wraith Lords to aid their dwindling warriors in battle. The world rune of the Iyanden craftworld means light in the darkness, a reference to the ever-burning shrine that honors Asurian and the flame of hope for the Asuryani. Next, the Saim-Han. The Asuryani craftworld of Saim-Han was one of the first craftworlds to abandon the crone worlds as the fall of the Eldari approached, heeding their far-seers' warnings. As such, they have spent far more time isolated from the rest of the Asuriani than the other major craft worlds, although the Saimhan do maintain contact with and have a very similar culture to the Exodite worlds. They are fierce warriors who place upon martial honor a higher value than their sophisticated kin. This, coupled with their pride, has sadly led them into conflict with each other and different craft worlds. While this generally takes the form of an organized duel between representatives of each craft world, in which first blood is usually sufficient to end the matter, the high number of deaths from these conflicts has lent to the barbaric reputation of this craft world among other Asuriani. The Asuriani of Saimhan bear the Eldari world rune that represents the serpent as their heraldry, sporting it on the cowlings of their jet bikes, gav tanks, and aircraft. The words Saimhan mean quest for enlightenment, for the Eldari word for snake and secret knowledge is identical, Saim. In Eldari myth, the serpent is the only creature believed to exist in both the material and the psychic universes at the same time. Hence, the serpent is said to know all secrets, past and present. And the last of the major craft worlds, Ulthwé. One of the largest craft worlds, Ulthwé was caught in the pull of the Eye of Terror after it erupted into being, and now orbits it. As such, it faces a constant danger of attack by chaos marauders and demons, and has served as a bastion against the forces of the Dark Gods for thousands of Terran years. The constant war and risk of attack has hardened the Craftworld citizens, and it maintains a standing militia force known as the Black Guardians, who are highly skilled and better trained than the Guardians of most other craft worlds. Its proximity to the Eye has also given Ulthwé an unusually large number of potent psykers, even for the Eldari. One of the most famous and integral aspects of the Ulthwé craft world is that of its Seer Council, formerly led by the now exiled Eldred Ulthran, who was banished due to his support for the Inari. The council both overtly and secretly interferes with other races, particularly humanity, in an attempt to steer fate in the Eldari's favor. This practice has no doubt allowed them to survive so long in such a perilous position. This craftworld's rune, the Eye of Isha, symbolizes the sorrow of Isha, the goddess of the harvest and fertility from whom the Eldari believe they descend. Isha, it is said, wept bitterly when Asurion, the king of the gods, ordered her separation from her mortal children. Vol forged her tears into the first glittering spirit stones, so that her grief might not be in vain, and mortals might still be able to commune in some form with the realm of the gods. Today, the warriors of Ulthwé bear this symbol as their sigil, a poignant reminder of the divinity they lost long ago. As Eldari from every corner of their ancient empire wallowed in their most unnatural impulses in the pursuit of debauchery, and the pleasure cults gained a tighter hold over their society, the Eldari became increasingly divided. Those who saw early on the foulness that corrupted their people for what it was became known as Exodites, and they departed to found newly terraformed colony planets called Maiden Worlds on the fringes of their empire. These Exodites were mocked by the majority of their people, for they eschewed much of their race's supreme technologies and returned instead to a simpler and more spiritual way of life, where hard labor was needed to raise food and carry out all the other necessities of survival. And yet, it was the Exodites alone who would wholly avoid the horror that was to follow. Upon their new homes, they could isolate themselves from the Eldari's brewing corruption and hedonism, and survive the cataclysm that would soon consume their people. The Exodites of the 41st millennium live startlingly pre-industrial and primitive lives compared to other Eldari factions like the Asuriani and Drukari, having chosen to abandon the automated labor-saving technologies that long defined Eldari life in return for the spiritual health brought by pursuing the hard labor of survival for oneself. The Exodites learned to once more cultivate crops and harvest other natural resources by hand, like their ancient ancestors, and their societies adapted to a more rigorous and physical culture compared to those of the craftworlds or the webway, who still make use of the Eldari's advanced automated technology to maintain a labor-free existence. Where the craftworld Eldari cling to the past of their race and preserve all they can of their fallen civilization, the Exodites have turned their backs away from ancient tradition in favor of a simpler, harder way of life. The worlds of the Exodites are savage and untamed, their meager settlements coexisting with wild beasts of all kinds. They are too few and too scattered to disrupt the delicate balance of nature. Many are only occupied for a few months of the local year, because on many worlds the Exodites are moving with the seasons and the herds. They time their migrations according to when they must collect and plant their crops, remaining only long enough to gather what they previously planted in the spring, and staying until it is time to plant the following year's crop and set off once again. Creatures that inhabit these worlds are numerous and varied. Most of the Exodite worlds are home to large herds of megadons and other gigantic reptilian beasts they refer to as dragons. These creatures are not native to their regions, as the early Eldari settlers intentionally spread them throughout all their worlds so that they are now quite common. The Exodites follow these herds as they graze, carefully managing them for food, not only partaking of their flesh, but of their blood as drink, skins as clothing and leatherwork, and bones and horns, which act in part as substitute for psychoplastic substances such as the wraith bone used by the craftworld Eldari. Dragons are diverse and contain different kinds of species, some of which are unique to specific worlds and used in different ways according to their size and nature. The massive herbivores known as megadons are slow-witted and easy to manage, although deadly if panicked or mistreated. These creatures provide most of the material resources used by the Exodites. Smaller megadons are used to transport cargo and people across the great plains of their worlds. A large megadon, on the other hand, is capable of carrying a massive structure on its back, bearing the most enormous weight without concern. The smaller carnivorous dragons ridden by the Exodites warriors, called Dragon Knights, are used to herd and control the herbivorous megadons. These warriors are so adept as to be practically born into the tall dragon saddles, consummate riders, wielding their long lances with ease. A stab with one of their lances will turn or stop a megadon without causing it any harm, but the same blow would knock the most hardy Eldari to the ground, lifeless. Such warriors are an integral part of Exodite societies. They play an important role as protectors of each community, as well as acting to safeguard their valuable resources from predators and the like. Like the Asuriani and their infinity circuits, the Exodites rely on psychoactive crystalline technology to protect their souls from consumption by the thirst of the Chaos God Slaanesh upon death. Their worlds are crisscrossed by a network of crystalline stone circles and menhirs that act as world shrines where the Exodite fallen can have their souls merge from soul stones after death with what is known as the World Spirit. The diverse peoples of the Eldari have each created their own measures to avoid their spirits being consumed by Slaanesh. The Asuriani wear psycho-crystalline spirit stones that act as safe havens for their souls at the moment of their deaths. These spirit stones are then interred within a craftworld's infinity circuit, a haven where the dead are protected from the great enemy's clutches while still able to communicate with the living. The Harlequins pledge themselves to Kegorak, the laughing god, who collects their souls, while the Drukari ensure others suffer so they do not. A devil's bargain that only postpones their fate. However, there is a new faction of Eldari who believe they have a way of not just avoiding the predations of Slaanesh, but defeating the Chaos God entirely. The Inari, or Reborn, are a rising force that pay heed to ancient Eldari belief that as more and more of their race die and their spirits pass into the infinity circuits of the craft worlds, they might form a Gestalt consciousness. When every last one of them passes, they will awaken and empower the birth of a new being. You need the Whispering God, the Eldari god of the dead. That baleful presence will be strong enough to destroy Slaanesh, so ending the dreaded curse that the Dark God has held over the Eldari since its loathsome birth over 10,000 years ago. The High Farseer Eldred Ulthran of Ulthwé attempted to begin this awakening process early at the Battle of Port de Mesnes in 999 M41, but his plots only stirred the sentience in the warp that would become Unid. Soon after, on the night of revelations in Komorak, a fraction of the Whispering Gods' will and power was imparted into a single soul, Yvraine, the Daughter of Shades. In that instant, she became a conduit for deathly energies, a reservoir of Eldari spirits that live on within her. This power could be attained by all who pledged themselves to the service of Unid. No longer would death hold any fear, as the souls of the departed would be harnessed not by spirit stones or other such technological means, but by the living themselves. Acting as the chosen prophet and emissary of Unid, Yvraine has traveled across the galaxy, visiting craftworlds, far-flung Eldari corsair fleets, and hidden nooks of the webway. With every passing day, the Ynnari grow in number, attracting followers from a wide variety of backgrounds who believe that the cycle of death and rebirth could be their salvation. Although a young movement, the Ynnari have already shaped the galaxy, most notably by their instrumental role in the resurrection of the Ultramarines Primarch Robert Guilliman, to lead the Imperium of Man during the events of the Ultramar campaign of the 13th Black Crusade. And yet, many amongst the Eldari, particularly among the always self-serving Drukhari, have rejected the Ynnari, seeing them as misguided and dangerous. Yvraine and the Reborn have pressed on regardless, seeking to reunite the time-lost Eldari artifacts known as the Crone Words, so that they may act as the focal point for Ynid's full awakening. Only then can the surging tides of chaos be turned, and a united Eldari race saved and restored. In the wake of the fall, the ancient Eldari civilization was reduced to a broken diaspora, their empire destroyed by the aftershock of Slaanesh's inception. And yet, those adherents of the pleasure cults hidden in the settlements within the webway remained all but untouched, protected by the nature of the webway's substance from the soul thirst of the newborn Chaos God. Great swaths of the labyrinth dimension itself were shattered into ruin, but many of those Eldari who had built personal empires in and around Comorak survived the birth of Slaanesh. The echoes of the new god's arrival had wrought insidious changes within them, changes whose horrific nature would not be fully comprehended until later. But the Comorite Eldari had escaped destruction. In their supreme arrogance, they did not cease their quest for excess or pleasure, even for a moment. Repentance and atonement were alien concepts to a people who acknowledge no limits to their power. The Eldari sealed within the webway had not escaped the fall, though this horror would only dawn on them slowly, rather than having their essence consumed in one great draught. Their souls were slowly draining away into the warp, consumed over time by Slaanesh, rather than all at once. Where the craftworld Eldari learned to deny its hold upon them using the mystical spirit stones and infinity circuits, as well as the strictures of the Asuriani path to deny the pull of their darker impulses, the Comorite Eldari became expert at ensuring that lesser intelligence beings suffered in their stead. Provided they steep themselves in the most extreme and decadent acts, the Eldari of the Webway found that the curse of Slaanesh could be abated. The psychic agony of others nourished their withered souls and kept them vital and strong, filling their frames with unnatural energies. Assuming they could feed regularly enough, the Webway dwellers became physically immune to the passage of time, thus using this parasitic immortality to hold off their deaths indefinitely. And so it was that the Drukhari were born, sadistic, psychic parasites who subsist upon the anguish of others in order to prevent the slow death of their immortal souls. 10,000 Terran years later, in the 41st millennium, Slaanesh's thirst pulls at them still. There truly is no escape. The the Drukhari have unwittingly doomed themselves, exchanging a horrific but mercifully swift end for an eternity of ghoulish starvation. To this day, the Drukhari raid the galaxy from the canker upon creation that is Komorak, sowing misery and destruction wherever they emerge, and spiriting away countless captives to their lairs for their own horrible ends. They are masters of torture and degradation, for the longer a Drukhari can drag out the punishment and agony of a captive of any sentient race, the greater the psychic nourishment that can be derived from it. A Drukhari who has recently fed upon the torment of others shines with a cold and startling aura, their physical form restored to perfection even as the spirit within festers. One who is starved of such energies for long enough will become a shadow, desperately hunting for a taste of pain with which to stave off the gnawing pangs in the depths of their soul. The Drukhari possess no psychers among their people, despite possessing the same innate psychic potential as other Eldari. Even within the protective confines of the webway, the threat of drawing the attention of Slaanesh to the mind of a potent psyker is simply too great a risk. Then we have the Harlequins. The Harlequins are the strangest and most enigmatic of all the Eldari factions. They are warrior acrobats, battlefield performers, who make no distinction between war and art, and whose breathtaking feats of agility and violence make them the terror of all those they face. Using the hidden paths of the webway, the masks of the Harlequins strike without warning and kill without mercy. The Harlequins are superlative battlefield artists, yet there are more than just warriors. Every one of them is a devoted servant of Kegorak, the Laughing God, the only Eldari deity said to have survived the birth of Slaanesh fully intact. While depicted as an enigmatic and sinister trickster whose deeds are far from altruistic, Kegorak is also the sworn enemy of the dark gods of chaos, and of Slaanesh in particular. The Harlequins have fought to exact Kegorak's vengeance upon she who thirsts for the destruction of the ancient Eldari civilization for Terran millennia. After its birth, each Eldari faction found different ways to stave off the soul thirst of the Dark Prince. The Asuriani make use of spirit stones in the infinity circuit of their craftworlds, while the Drukhari are psychic vampires, ghoulishly preserving their own immortality by basking in the psychic emanations of torture and suffering. The Harlequins, by contrast, require no such spiritual defenses. When a Harlequin falls, Kegorak instantly snatches their souls away, thus denying Slaanesh its feast. How this can be and what fate awaits those souls within the grasp of the Laughing God are secrets that the Harlequins have never deigned to share with the rest of their race. They strike without warning, wreaking devastation before vanishing as suddenly as they came. They have slaughtered zealous cults, assassinated mighty chaos champions, and undone countless foul plans before they could manifest. Sometimes these actions have saved the worlds of other races, most commonly of humanity, but there is no kindness in their deeds. They are every bit as ineffable and enigmatic as the deity they worship, and if they are concerned with the survival of any species in the galaxy, ultimately it is their own. The duties of the masks of the Harlequins extend beyond warfare. Everyone is a performer, versed in the mythic cycles of the Eldari and the countless allegorical tales that stem from them. The masks travel endlessly through the interstitial dimension known as the Webway, moving between craftworlds, exodite worlds, and the dark city of Komarag freely. Wherever they go, they ply their performing arts, combining music, dance, ritual combat, nuanced oration, and the breathtaking suite of illusory and psychoactive effects to captivate Eldari audiences. They perform for more than mere entertainment. Every show they put on is a lesson and a cautionary tale, a fragment of the culture of the ancient Eldari presented as a reminder and a warning to their modern descendants. The most important dance that the Harlequins perform is the Tale of the Fall, the monstrous spiritual apocalypse during which Slaanesh was birthed and the Eldari all but annihilated. Their vivid performances ensure the horrors of that time will never be forgotten and its mistakes never repeated. They have other duties and service to their god as well. They stalk the webway, seeking to excise the taint of chaos and alien invasion wherever it is found. They guard the vast repository of forbidden chaos lore kept within the secret craft world known as the Black Library, preventing its dangerous secrets from falling into the hands of those who would do great harm with them. The Harlequins also act as ambassadors, for they alone can travel freely through all the dimensions of the Eldari factions. When needs must, they have brokered uneasy deals between the Asuriani of the Craft Worlds and the Drukari of Komarag, bidding their kin put aside their differences in order to fight for their people's future. Now, though, the Harlequins face a new peril. The webway, always a fractured and hazardous realm, has been sorely damaged by the opening of the Great Rift. Alien invaders and chaos-worshipping interlopers spill through its sundered gates in numbers never before seen, endangering all that the Harlequins are and all they strive to achieve. As the danger grows greater, so the masks become ever more vicious and manipulative, calling in favors long owed and committing whatever atrocities they must in the name of the Laughing God. They have a higher purpose, a final act they mean to see performed in full, to the eternal detriment of she who thirsts, and they will pay whatever blood price they must in order to see their work complete. The Outcasts and Corsairs. Asuriani outcasts, known as Anrathe in the Eldari lexicon, are those Asuriani who have taken up the path of the outcast and left their home craft world to wander the galaxy when they find the rigid Asuriani lifestyle suffocating. Some may even leave the Asuriani path altogether. Such exile can also occur because these Eldari have committed some unforgivable crime against their fellow Asuriani, such as walking the path of damnation that leads to consumption by the Eldari's darkest impulses. There are many kinds of outcast, each with a varying degree of dissociation from their kin. Some craftworlders simply yearn for the undiscovered vistas of open space and take the road less traveled, codified among the people of the craftworlds as the path of the outcast until their wanderlust is sated. The majority of them eventually return home to take up a new path and rejoin their people, bringing with them alien treasures and tales of new worlds, fabulous discoveries, and battles on the edges of the galaxy that help to enrich the broader Asuryani society. Many Asuryani leave the path entirely, spending Terran years or solar decades in exile. During this time, they must bear the terrible burden of their heightened consciousness without the protection of their rigid self-discipline offered by the path. Their physically potent and sensitive minds are a beacon to predatory demons, and in particular to the great enemy Slaanesh. So, only Eldari of especially strong character and will can survive for long. These outcasts leave their craft worlds to carve out lives elsewhere, often wandering the galaxy and visiting the worlds of humanity, or seeking to experience the wild and technologically primitive lives of the exodites of the Maiden Worlds. These inscrutable nomads are welcome aboard craft worlds only briefly, for their minds are dangerously unguarded and can attract predators from the psychic realms of the warp. Many of them are also disruptive in another sense, for simply by their presence, they can distract young and inexperienced Eldari from the Asuryani path, as romantic tales of travel and freedom follow in their wake. The wildest of all outcasts become Eldari corsairs and raiders. They often continue to trade with and visit their home craft world, whilst plundering the starships of humans, orcs, and even other Eldari. These mavericks may even sometimes hire out their services as mercenaries to alien races, while many a voyage of exploration has turned into a military venture. As home and the disciplines of the Asuryani path become increasingly remote, the naturally wild and amoral character of the Eldari resurfaces. Eldari pirates are quick-tempered and unpredictable, equally inclined to magnanimity and wanton slaughter, and many of their fleets have become infamous. On occasion, corsair fleets will join with the ships of a craft world in response to a common threat, while at other times, a craft world may aid its corsair, or in even rarer circumstances, even Drukhari, cousins on a mission of war, all of which adds to the illusion of mankind that the Eldari as a whole are little more than a race of piratical raiders and slavers hell-bent on indiscriminate slaughter. It is for this reason that so many Asuryani outcasts are often confused with their Drukhari counterparts. Those outcasts who walk this path for too long may ultimately be consumed by the path of damnation, and so begin to be enslaved by the same lust for suffering and death that corrupted both their Drukhari cousins and the ancient Eldari pleasure cults that led to the fall of their civilization more than 10,000 Terran years ago. More than a few of them have made their way to Komorak and found a new home among the sadistic folk of the Dark City. Not all who leave their craft worlds become wandering nomads or piratical Eldari corsairs. A select few hear the laughter of the Eldari god Kegorak in their dreams, and join the enigmatic Harlequin troops who travel between the realms of their divided kin as performers and messengers, seeking to keep alive a common Eldari culture. Many more have joined the growing Inari movement, flocking to the banner of Ivrain, the prophet of Unid, the god of the dead. The elders of the craft worlds have, for the most part, condemned the new faction's radical beliefs as dangerous and misguided, branding those of the Asuryani who turned their backs on the old ways as the pathless. The Eldari cling tenaciously to their folklore and traditions. The characters and events of ancient legend are commonly discussed, and comparisons drawn between mythic events and those of the present day. Every Eldari is familiar with the epic songs and dances that form their mythic cycles, and references to these tales are immediately understood by others of their race. The principal characters of the Eldari mythic cycles are the gods, their mortal descendants the Eldari, and the monstrous adversaries they fought. The chief and oldest of all the gods is Asurion, the Phoenix King and leader of the Pantheon. His first brother is Cain, the bloody-handed god. Cain is the master of both war and murder, and he symbolizes wanton destruction and martial prowess. Third of the greatest gods is Vol, the crippled smith god who is often depicted chained to his own anvil. Isha is the goddess of the harvest, from whom the Eldari race is descended. The youngest goddess is Liliath, the maiden, mistress of dreams and fortune, whilst the third of the trinity of Eldari goddesses is Morai Heg, the crone, an ancient and withered creature who holds the fates of mortals inside a rune pouch made of skin. As well as the many gods, there are countless mortal heroes descended from the gods who founded the great houses still echoed today upon the craftworld. These include the great hero Slaanesh, who was slain by Cain and whose blood is said to drip eternally from the war god's hands. Slaanesh had many descendants, the Eldar, of whom Inriam the Young was the last. Rivals to Slaanesh were the descendants of his brother, Ulthanash, whose bloodline exists upon craftworld Eondon to this day. At the moment of its birth, Slaanesh decimated the Eldari pantheon and stole the gods' power, with only 2 of their number surviving the fall of the Eldari. The laughing god Kegorak escaped through guile, while Cain, the strongest and most warlike of the Eldari deities, endured through might. Slaanesh and the bloody-handed god fought a titanic battle in the warp, and despite Cain's mastery of war, Slaanesh, glutted with stolen power from the souls of the Eldari and the other gods, eventually proved the stronger. But, exhausted from the struggle, Slaanesh could not destroy and consume the Eldari god outright. Instead, Cain was rent into fragments. Each shard of the war god came to rest within the wraithbone core of a craftworld, where it took root and grew into an avatar of the bloody-handed god. To this day, these murderous avatars are still awoken by the craftworlds to lead the Asuryani to war. While the Eldari still revere all the gods of the ancient pantheon and preserve their stories within the mythic cycles, they do not call on them for aid or hope for their intervention any longer. However, a new god, Yenid, the Eldari god of death, who is not a part of the old myth cycles, was long said to be forming from the souls of the Eldari dead within the infinity circuits of the Asuryani craftworlds. Yenid's awakening was dramatically accelerated during the Battle of Port Demesnes in 999 M41 by a ritual undertaken by the Farseer Eldrad Ulthran. Partially awakened within the Immaterium, Yendid reached out across the galaxy and chose the former Eldari Corsair and Comodite arena gladiator Yvraine, the Daughter of Shades, to serve as his prophet and high priestess. She founded a new Eldari religious group, the Inari, who in the era Indomitus seek to unite all the Eldari factions across the galaxy to destroy Slaanesh and restore the Eldari's lost glory. Kayla Mencha Kane is one of the only two surviving gods of the Eldari before the recent awakening of Yenid. In the old Eldari pantheon, he was second only to Asuryan himself in power, and was often shown as the enemy of Vol, the Smith god. He's also the most violent and reckless of the gods. Asuryan was so appalled by Kane's murder of Eldanesh, a mortal Eldari, that he cursed him and made his hands drip eternally with the blood of Eldanesh, so that all would remember what he had done. The Eldari say that when Slaanesh awoke, it consumed each of the other Eldari gods in the warp in turn. While his counterparts were all devoured, Kane took up his great sword and did battle with Slaanesh in the Immaterium. Kane was not strong enough to destroy it, but he too was too powerful to be defeated. Instead, his psychic signature in the warp was broken and scattered into pieces. These divine fragments were driven from the warp where they had done battle and came to rest in the heart of the infinity circuit of each craftworld. These pieces of the god became the avatars of Kayla Mencha Kane that serve as the most potent unit to provide support to the Asuryani militaries of the craftworlds. In times of war, the Asuryani can awaken the avatars to lead them into battle, though the prize is the sacrifice of an aspect warrior's life, for the avatar needs to possess a physical body to enter the material universe. The avatars of Kane are towering monsters with skin of iron and molten cores, hands permanently dripping with blood as Kane's did in the mythic cycles. Next we have the only other known surviving god of the ancient Eldari pantheon, Kegorag, also known as the Laughing God, the Great Harlequin, the Great Fool, and the First Fool, was a consummate trickster and the greatest artist among the Eldari gods. While most of their gods were destroyed by Slaanesh during the fall of the Eldari, according to legend, this deity survived because his mocking and self-interested nature distanced him from the collective psychic corruption and decadence of the ancient Eldari Empire that birthed the Dark Prince. Other legends tell that when all the other gods were destroyed, Kegorag fled before Slaanesh until Kane rose to do battle with She Who Thirsts. It is said that during the fight between them, the Laughing God hid behind Kane for protection, and in the aftermath of the struggle, he fled into the webway where Slaanesh could not find him. He still resides there, and is the only being in the universe who knows exactly where every door in the webway leads. As the master and patron god of the mysterious Harlequins, he is the only Eldari god that still remains in his original form, and he is dedicated to finding a way for the Eldari to defeat Slaanesh and reclaim their ancient greatness, a plan he and his followers call the Final Act. The Harlequins are protected from the soul thirst of Slaanesh in a different way from their craftworld brethren. While the Asuryani wear spirit stones which absorb their souls when they die to prevent them from being devoured by Slaanesh in the warp, the Harlequins are directly protected by their faith in their god's power, becoming one with his warp emanation upon their death. The only exception to this are the Harlequin solitaires, whose souls must be won from Slaanesh after their deaths by the Laughing God. Next, of course, Asurian, the King of the Gods. Sometimes known as the Phoenix King, Asurian was the king of the pantheon of Eldari gods. While the mythic cycles seem to indicate that he held sway over all the others, he was, nevertheless, consumed by Slaanesh in the warp. He is often depicted in relation to fire and light, his chief symbols. The Asuryani believe that it is Asurian who taught them how to use the Asuryani path to prevent their darker natures from overwhelming them, and is the reason they named themselves the Asuryani, the children of Asurian. Then we have Isha, the goddess of the harvest, the great mother of the Eldari race. Isha is treated as a fertility goddess by the Eldar in many respects. She was imprisoned by Cain for a period of time until Vol paid her ransom. She is often depicted crying, and her symbol is a teared eye, symbolic of her sorrow in being separated from her mortal children. Her tears are said to have solidified to form the spirit stones which keep the Asuryani safe from Slaanesh after their death. It is rumored among the Asuryani that Isha has not been consumed by Slaanesh like most of the other Eldari gods, for the chaos god Nurgle, the Plague Lord, coveted the Eldari fertility goddess and rescued her from consumption, only to imprison her in his decaying mansion that lies within his foul realm in the warp. Those same stories claim that Nurgle cares for her by keeping her within a cage and feeding her the various diseases he concocts, only for her to whisper the cures for each one to mortals in real space when his back is turned. Next, Vol, the god of the forges. The artificer and smith of the Eldari gods, Vol is one of the central deities of their pantheon and an eternal enemy to Cain. In order to purchase the freedom of his fellow gods Kurnos and Isha after they had been imprisoned by the war god for violating Asurian's law against the gods, remaining separate from their mortal children, Cain demanded 100 blades from the smith god as payment for their freedom. Vol was unable to finish the last divinely crafted blade in time, and so hid a mortal forged blade amid the others of divine craftsmanship. This fooled Cain long enough to get Isha and Kurnos to freedom, but when the blood-handed god realized he had been tricked, he cried out for vengeance. Vol finished the final divine blade, Anaris, the Dawn Light, and took it to do battle with Cain. Though it was the greatest of all swords, Cain was the better warrior and crippled Vol. The smith god is often shown chained to his anvil, the punishment that Cain set upon him for his deception. Then we have Morai Heg, the goddess of fate. The crone goddess Morai Heg is also the consort of Cain and the third in a trinity of female Eldari goddesses, including Lilith and Isha, who together represent maiden, mother, and crone. Morai Heg appears as an ancient and withered creature who holds the fate of mortals inside a rune pouch made of Eldari skin. In Eldari myth, she sought to partake of the eternal wisdom contained in her divine blood. She manipulated her husband, the war god Cain, to cut off her hand so that she might drink deep of her own vitae. With this deed, she gained the knowledge that she sought, and in return Cain gained the aspect of the Banshee. Her severed fingers each became one of the Eldari artifacts known as the Crone Words, now sought by the Ynnari to fully awaken Ynid, the god of the dead. The original homeworlds of the Eldar that were lost to the Eye of Terror after the fall became known as Crone Worlds, a reference to the Crone goddess. The inhabitants of Craftworld Yggdrasil are noted for being devoted followers of Morai Heg. Then, Ynid, the god of the dead. Ynid, the whispering god, is a dream, the embodiment of a possibility that has yet to be fully realized. Some Asuryani seers long believed that when the last Asuryani dies during the Rana Dandra, the final battle with chaos, Ynid will be born from the warp with the strength of all the Asuryani souls stored in the infinity circuits of the craft worlds and the world spirits of the Exodites. Ynid will then have the power to destroy Slaanesh forever in a final battle, thus correcting the mistakes which led to the fall and allowing the race to be reincarnated into a universe free of the taint of chaos. Or at least, that is what the Asuryani believed would happen for almost 10,000 standard years. Then, in 999 M41, during the Battle of Port Demesnes on the moon of Cahiria, the High Farsia Eldrad Ulthran partially completed a ritual intended to awaken Ynid using the power of the souls found in the infinity circuits of every craft world in the galaxy. While the intervention of the Imperial Death Watch interrupted the ritual before it could be completed, the god of the dead was partially awakened and sought out a champion and prophet to complete his rise in the form of Yvraine, the daughter of Shades. She founded a new Eldari faction dedicated to the Whispering God's resurrection, known as the Ynnari. The Ynnari, with members drawn from the Craftworld Eldari, the Harlequins, the Asuryani Outcasts, and the Drukhari of Komorak, seek the restoration of the ancient Eldari race by collecting the artifact known as the Crone Words from across the galaxy. Their combined ritualistic use at a single focused point in real space will allow Ynid to fully manifest his power in the warp, where he will combat Slaanesh, hopefully destroying the Prince of Chaos and freeing the Eldari from the soul-devouring curse of she who thirsts forever. Only then will the Eldar people, restored to the unity of the ancient Eldari, seek to rebuild a new and better interstellar empire. Here are some of the most infamous Eldari technologies. First, the Infinity Circuit. An Infinity Circuit is a crystalline, psychoactive matrix contained at the core of all Asuryani craft worlds, their massive spacecraft, and is essentially composed of the wraith-bone skeleton of the craft world itself. Within this matrix, the souls of all the craft world's dead reside in a form of group consciousness, providing both a well of psychic power for the world ship and a massive ancestral mind to advise and guide the living. With the birth of Slaanesh, she who thirsts, the Infinity Circuit is the closest thing that the Asuryani now have to an afterlife. For if their souls are not captured at death in a spirit stone and integrated into the Infinity Circuit, they will be lost into the warp and their soul energy devoured by Slaanesh. For this reason, they will defend their craft world with a fury and tenacity that is almost unrivaled among sentient species. They risk losing not only their home, but the souls of their ancestors as well. Once their soul is part of the circuit, an Eldari continues to exist forever, save from the predations of the warp, their individual consciousness remaining as a potential within the circuit. The Infinity Circuit is therefore far more than a source of energy for the craft world. It is a place of refuge and eternal rest, from where the dead watch over the living. Then we have the Spirit Stone. An Asuryani Spirit Stone, also known as a Waystone, Dreamstone, and a Tear of Isha, is a small, seemingly precious gem carried in a variety of different aesthetically pleasing settings. Craftworld Eldari's chest, used to save their souls from consumption after death within the Monasterium by Slaanesh. Every Asuryani of the craftworld wears a shining gem or polished stone upon their breast. This psycho-receptive waystone is attuned solely to the mind of its owner. At the moment of their death, the stone acts like a psychic trap, absorbing their psychic self, their soul, and preventing it from entering the warp and being consumed. As such, psychic energies carry with them a large part of an Eldari's sense of identity, personality, and memories. It is quite correct to think of them as souls. The Waystone can then be brought back to the Asuryani's own craft world and embedded into its wraith-bone core, where it will grow into a larger spirit stone. Once the stone is implanted, the individual Eldari soul it contains can travel freely through the psychically reactive wraith-bone, mingling with other Eldari souls and forming part of the communal spirit of the craft world itself. All the souls within a craft world collectively exist within the Infinity Circuit. In times of dire need, the Asuryani are also able to retrieve the spirit stones of long-dead Asuryani heroes and place them into the artificial bodies of Wraithguard and Wraithlord constructs. These constructs are then piloted by the Asuryani soul, which experiences reality in this form as a dream. This process is considered little better than necromancy in Eldari culture, and is only done as a last resort. These stones can also be placed within certain Asuryani vehicles like gravity tanks and Eldar Titans, where they allow the captive Eldari spirit to control the vehicle in case its living pilots are incapacitated, similar to the way the artificially intelligent machine spirits found in certain Imperial vehicles like Land Raiders can take over control of the vehicle even when it is unmanned. And then we have Wraithbone. Wraithbone is the primary construction material used by the Asuriani, the craftworld Eldari, and a staple of their psycho-technical engineering. It is a form of crystallized psychic energy that can exist as a solid in real space, brought forth from the warp and shaped by an Eldari concentrating their thoughts and intent upon it. All Eldar are able to psychically influence and control Wraithbone to a certain extent. For instance, most of them walking the path of the artisan will use Wraithbone in order to create the pieces of art, musical instruments, or any other tools they desire. However, truly complex constructions such as functional weapons or whole void ships can only be brought into existence by the Eldari Bone Singers, specialized craftsmen who focus on understanding and mastering the intricacies of creating, growing, and shaping the Wraithbone through the application of their innate psychic power. It is a psychic conductor and thus provides not only the structure and armor for the things built of it, but also the power distribution and communication systems, since Wraithbone carries psychic energy the way a wire or fiber optic cable carries electricity or photons. Wraithbone is also a psychoplastic material that is highly resilient to damage and capable of limited self-repair. It and the other building materials of the Eldari will grow and react more like living tissue than the building materials of other intelligent species, save for the Tyranids' bio-constructs and, of course, the necrodermis, the Necron living metal that is the basis of a majority of the Necron's technology. And of course, we have the Webway. Now, the Webway was created by the ancient species called the Old Ones as a means of intergalactic travel. Via the Webway, the armies of these advanced beings could appear from hidden gateways in reality to strike at their foes without warning. Furthermore, this sprawling network allowed the Old Ones to voyage between the worlds of their dominion without risking the fickle tides of the warp. Known by some as the Labyrinth Dimension, the Webway has been envisioned by mortal minds in myriad ways. Some describe it as a galactic tapestry of shimmering strands, others a maze of glowing tunnels, or the veins of some vast living entity. All such accounts fall short of the truth, however, for the Webway defies neat categorization. It is an elegantly crafted extra-dimensional realm located between real space and the Monasterium, analogous to the surface of a still, dark pool or a fine silk veil drawn across something foul. In the wake of their disappearance or destruction during the War in Heaven against the Necrons and their Catan masters, the Old Ones left the care and use of the Webway to their Eldari creations, who used it for millennia to tie together their great empire. It once spanned the galaxy, even stretching out into the empty void beyond. Those days are long gone. Ravaged by war and catastrophe, many of its tunnels have been torn open or amputated entirely, and a great number of its entrances have been sealed by the Eldari themselves as a desperate measure to deny their foes access. Despite its degradation, the Eldari of every subculture still rely upon the Webway for swift travel, and none more so than the nomadic Harlequins. It is said that Kegorak is the only being in existence who knows every single path through it. This might explain how his disciples possess such an intimate knowledge of its twists and turns, for the Harlequins walk the webway without fear, appearing and disappearing at will. They utilize their knowledge of its hidden paths to outmaneuver their foes and strike from unexpected quarters. In this way, entire masks of Harlequins can position themselves in ambush, guaranteeing the element of surprise. Of course, such a system is not perfect, for the webway has become a broken and dangerous realm, the manifestation of the Great Rift at the start of the era Indomitus tore at it, ripping away spars already weakened by the passage of millennia and unraveling others, laying them open to the warp. Gates long sealed burst open to admit a legion of nightmares, and malefic chaos worshippers found themselves at liberty to strike at the labyrinth dimension like never before. The servants of the Laughing God are so well versed in the webway's secret routes that many other Eldari have credited them with supernatural powers. It is they who watch over the Black Library alongside its dark guardians and use its secrets to gain the upper hand in their war against chaos.